What role does waste play in global warming? Does it produce greenhouse gases? What happens to our waste? Is it buried? Is it treated? Is it exported? If you want to find out more, listen to Jessie Poon, geographer at the University of Buffalo in New York.
Hello, everyone. My name is Jessie Poon. I'm a professor of geography at the University of Buffalo here in New York. Today, I'm going to speak about trading waste. Now, you might ask me, why is waste important for addressing climate change? So the average person generates somewhere between 1 to 2.4 kilograms of waste every day. This averages out to about 0.74 kilograms of waste. 20% of global methane emissions are generated by the waste sector. So if you look at the figure on the right side, you can see that besides wetlands, where you have decomposition and therefore the release of gases, you also have waste as one of the important sources of methane emissions. Now, according to the United Nations Economic Commission for Europe, methane poses more than 80 times the global warming threat of carbon dioxide over a 20-year period. 60% of methane emissions are human-induced, and methane accounts for around 30% of the rise in global temperatures since the Industrial Revolution. The United Nations Economic Commission for Europe has put out a report which basically suggests that perhaps addressing methane gas will produce more immediate effects than cutting carbon dioxide. So waste is important, as you can see, as a source of emissions. And that's why it brings me to the topic of waste. What are the different kinds of waste? Well, by EU standards, we have municipal waste, industrial waste, manufacturing waste, hazardous waste, like radioactive waste. Sometimes hospital waste can also be fairly hazardous. But we come down to something I'm interested to talk about in the next slide, which is packaging. There are other ways of classifying waste, and Shama, for instance, provides a simpler version. Here is a nice way of thinking about waste through pictures. But really, I want to talk about packaging in this next slide. So most of us, when we go to the grocery store and we buy something, we put it into a plastic bag, or we put it in a plastic container, right? So whatever it is, some kind of a container to store our food, for example. But where does plastic come from? Well, to produce plastic, you need to go back to oil. Crude oil is the main sort of raw material source for the production of plastics, because when you refine crude oil, and to some extent gas, in fact, gas is becoming very important, what you produce are these hundreds of compounds, and one of these compounds is naphtha, which is mostly used for making plastics. Now, what we know from the OECD report is that in 2019, 1.8 billion tons of greenhouse gases were generated from plastic production. And then this was expected to more than double in 2060 to 4.3 billion tons of greenhouse gases. So what happens after you are done with your plastic bag? Well, in the UK, 46% of your plastics are incinerated, 17% are exported, and I'm kind of interested in this sector because it's one thing to produce products that you then dispose of in your backyard. It's another thing to produce the product, consume it, and then dump it on someone else's backyard in another country. So I'm interested in this. 25% of plastic waste are dumped in landfills, right? And so this is my point about exports, which I will be dealing with in greater detail, that a lot of Britain and America's plastics end up in Asia, in low-income country. So let's talk about the United States first, because 85% of waste in the United States winds up in landfills. And during decomposition of waste, landfills emit two major gases, methane and carbon dioxide. And the ratio is fairly even, slightly actually more than methane, but it's about 50%. Okay. Now, methane emissions in some ways are very important because, as you can see from here, nearly 17% of all US methane gases come from landfills. And then if you look at this, which is the New York State, where I'm living, New York City doesn't have any landfills. In fact, it dumps all its landfills on poorer counties on the western end of the state. So this is a kind of a story that's emerging where rich countries can afford to produce a lot of waste and they're dumping in landfills or incinerators somewhere else in another poorer, in this case, county, or in another poorer country in the case of exports. The European countries have a slightly different way of disposing their waste, right? And part of this reflects US and Europe's different endowments in land. So the European countries have less land compared to the United States. And so in France, for example, much of the municipal solid waste is incinerated. Incineration of 1 ton of municipal waste releases something like 0.7 to 1.7 tons of carbon dioxide. 75 million tons of waste were incinerated in the EU in 2017, according to an OECD report. So to be fair to the European countries, they've been trying to come up with ways to convert waste incineration and the energy that is generated during the incineration process into heat for homes, for heating your homes in the winter. Now, I thought it's interesting that this waste incinerator site in Denmark, for example, is trying to be environmentally friendly as well. It has a golf course on top of the incinerator, and they were trying to not have CO2 leak out to the atmosphere too much. So yes, they're trying to use incineration without producing the kind of carbon dioxide that worries us. So where does your waste go besides landfills and incinerators? It gets dumped in other countries. So I'm interested in exports here. The pollution haven hypothesis basically theorizes that countries that have stringent environmental policies or regulations, so they're quite strict about their environmental situation, basically exports waste to countries that are less strict or that are less environmentally stringent. One of the reasons for this is that high-income countries that tend to be more environmentally stringent find it more cost-effective to do so, to just simply export their waste to poorer countries than to build fairly expensive, capital-intensive waste handling infrastructure. It's also much cheaper to send the waste to developing countries where labor cost is cheaper when it comes to sorting of waste. So if you look on the right-hand side of the screen, you have a landfill in Xi'an, China. So this is one of the largest landfills in the world. It's like 100 times the size of football fields. And because China used to have a lot of cheap labor, it still does. The expectation is that you can use this cheap labor to sort your waste, sorting out sort of e-waste from your plastics, from your paper, for example, so that these poor folks can use that material for recycling. And so they earn a little income from that. But it's the question is whether this is an equitable solution to simply have rich countries dump their waste on poor countries. So here's a map that very vividly shows the pollution haven hypothesis. If you look at the United States as well as Europe, all of the plastic waste, at least in 2018, is going to China or Southeast Asia. Now, what's interesting is that China understood by 2016 and 2017 that it was the garbage dumpster of the world. And so it really didn't want to be that. So it imposed import restrictions at that time. So one of the consequences of imposing that restrictions is that it works. And we're going to see that later. What happened was before the restrictions, most of the paper waste from Europe went to China. After the restrictions, unfortunately, it simply reallocated to other poor countries in Southeast Asia and India. So overall, what we're seeing is that there is some support for the PHHDCs that rich, environmentally stringent countries are exporting their waste to poorer, environmentally less stringent countries. So today I want to look at slacks and draws and textiles and garments, because these two types of waste are less explored and examined in the scholarship. So you can see on the right side what an example of a slack waste is. And of course, you know, textile and clothing that you don't want to wear anymore. So these are worn clothing. So what we know is that today, more and more developing countries are joining the waste market. They're becoming serious polluters as well. So we know that Bangladesh sends 45% of its textile waste to China. China sends 21% of its industrial waste to Thailand. And part of it is because these BRIC countries or these newly industrializing economies are all becoming important consumers with a middle class, but also important industrial development have been happening in their countries. So they're becoming polluters as well. The question is whether the PHH thesis still stands given the number of countries from lower income that have joined the waste trade. So to do so, we implemented an empirical model. Me and my colleagues implemented an empirical model. This is the multi-layer network model. So I'm going to explain the multi-layer network model. Think of flows of trade. So an example would be flows of airlines as well. So these are flow data. Okay, so you have 5 different airlines here with their airline flows between airports. So you have origin, you have destination, and they're mapping all these various flows, and you have these networks. Each of these airlines will have a different network because obviously they serve different airports, for example. Well, rather than produce 5 different maps of 5 different airlines, what we do is we combine them into one model. The 5 layers or the 5 networks can be combined into one multi-layer network, which considers these interlayer networks. Out of this model comes centrality indices. So it will compute centrality indices, which gives you some sense of where the country stands in this network of flows. Where is its central position? And so you can calculate and get a sense of who is really dominating this network, which we call hubs for those that are exporting waste, and then havens for those that are importing waste. So we produce 4 layers of slacks and draws and 5 layers of textiles and garments. So slacks and draws would be iron and steel types of slacks, or it could be copper and aluminum and macadam kind of slacks, you know, that comes from construction. And then you also have for textiles, you can have textile waste from silk, from cotton, from polyester, from warm clothing, for example. The network analysis was performed over 150 countries, and the source of the data is the United Nations Comtrade database. So this is just a way to sort of exemplify what I was trying to say, which is that you have here 4 different kinds of slacks and draws. This is for iron and steel. This is for copper and aluminum. This is for macadam. And this is for other industrial slacks. And you can see that they have different networks, right? So rather than produce 9 different maps, what we did was we combined them into the multi-layer network. And this is the result. Rather than show you maps, we're going to produce the centrality indices itself. So it's not surprising in 2000, and of course, we're doing this for a 20-year period between 2000 and 2020 as well. So in 2000, it's not surprising that rich countries and more environmentally stringent countries were exporting a lot of industrial waste like slacks and draws. What is interesting is that a lot of industrial, high-income, environmentally stringent countries were also importing slacks and draws. So this challenges the PHH thesis a little bit. The second period in 2020, now you see developing countries, low-income countries becoming significant polluters. So they're all becoming hubs. China, Vietnam, India, UAE, Indonesia, Malaysia, they're all becoming important hubs. And not surprising, the havens, the importers are mostly in Asia as well. But what's interesting is that the United States and other, well, high-income countries like Australia are also importing industrial waste. So one speculation, and we've dug into the data, which I can't basically show you today, but one presumption here is that United States must find a market for slacks and draws. And we know from my engineering colleagues that they're turning metal waste and reusing it in the steel industry. They're also turning macadam waste for use on your roads. So a lot of the driveways in our houses and the roads near our neighborhoods, they're made from reused slack and draws. So perhaps this is good news. Let's look at the next slide for textiles and clothing. Again, high-income countries exporting a lot of textile waste, but so are they importing textile waste. So this captures the same pattern that we saw in the last slide, which is that high-income countries are exporting, but they are also importing in Europe and the United States. Then in 2020, Asia and lower income countries have become significant polluters, but they are also importing much of this waste. So are United States, Spain, Netherlands, Italy, Australia, Germany, and Japan. So you see 6 of the top importers are high-income countries as well. So again, this challenges the PHH thesis. First of all, we see more low-income countries coming up as polluters, but at the same time, they're actually exporting their waste back to rich countries. So the rich countries are now buying quite a bit of these textile and clothing waste from low-income countries. So that relationship in some ways is reversed. To further explore this, we ran the results through a gravity model. And the gravity model is sort of a spatial interaction model, which allows us to look at bilateral trade relations of trade, waste trade here. And the gravity equation is at the bottom of the slide here. Where I want to draw your attention is this variable, WEPI, which is really a sort of composite index that looks at environmental regulations, and we look at regulations for solid waste, for recycling, as well as for ocean plastics. The good news is the estimates are negative and also significant. Now, what's interesting is that this is telling us that if you are more environmentally stringent, you're exporting less. If you are environmentally stringent, you are importing less as well. So overall, what this model is telling us that stringent environmental regulations that work. But if you're still exporting, according to the multi-layer networks, the rich countries are picking up some of that waste. Perhaps this is because of the circular economy. Under the current linear economy, we take raw materials, we transform the raw materials and produce and manufacture products out of them. Then once we have no use for the product, we toss it, we put it in the dumpster. This is a linear economy. What I hope to do today is to try and encourage you to think of waste as a resource. In other words, think of the circular economy. Take that waste and turn it into a resource, turn it into an input by repairing, reusing, or recycling. Right now, according to the circular economy, only 8.6% of the global economy is circular. In other words, 90% of the global economy is still the linear economy, where a lot of products after use are dumped. What would be nice if we move towards a more circularity, where we think and transform that waste into intermediate inputs for other products. So what we are looking at are new business opportunities. I may have a pair of jeans that I've worn for a few months and then I don't like it anymore. But rather than dump it in my garbage can that then eventually goes to the landfill here in New York, I could recycle, have somebody else buy my jeans, which is still perfectly good to be used. This company, Vivea, at the bottom here, makes recycled shoes. All of his shoes are made from recycled material, and they're not cheap. This is a high-end pair of shoes. This pair of shoes costs $150. Now, in Brussels, Human is famous because all of the shops inside the shopping mall, the products are made from recycled materials. In other words, let's think of waste not as waste. Let's think of waste as a resource, because this is one way we can contribute to the reduction of methane and CO2 gases in the atmosphere. Here are my references for your information. I also have some supplementary notes on the multi-layer network model for those who are interested. Thank you very much for joining me today.